It's another beautiful day at Lake Tahoe. I almost hate to go in the shop. But you're not watching this DVD to see the scenery. I'm going to start you out on your segmented wood turning adventure with what I consider to be the easiest, simplest way to make a bowl using multiple pieces of wood. This is a technique that goes back well over 100 years. I first learned of it in Dale Nish's book Creative Wood Turning back in the 70s. He profiled in a few pages how to take a board and turn it into a bowl. I'm going to take this board. This happens to be a 7-inch square piece of bird's eye maple, and show you how to convert this piece of wood into a bowl exactly like this one. It's a simple, easy technique with no math, no miters. It is so easy it ought to be illegal. Let's go in the shop and we'll turn this board into this bowl. The first step with most all woodworking projects is to prepare your material. You want parallel, clean, smooth, square edges and so forth. It'll pay dividends later on. Here I'm splitting the board into two halves, and here I'm putting X's to maintain my wood grain alignment. Your success in this project really requires that you have a clear understanding of how to lay out the rings, the relationship between the angle of the rings and the distance between the rings. So I've drawn a few sketches to help you understand this whole process, this whole technique. In my first layout, I've placed the bandsaw cuts at a 45-degree angle. Notice the vertical dashed lines. These confirm that the bottom diameter of each ring matches the top diameter of its adjacent smaller ring. In my second sketch, I've drawn my angles much flatter. By doing so, I've been forced to reduce the number of rings, but I'll have more wall thickness to play with using this layout. The downside is I'll only be able to create a vessel 2 layers tall. As you can see in this third layout, I've placed my angles much closer together, and in order for the diameters to match, I've had to make the angles much steeper. Now this layout will give me a lot more rings and thus a much taller vessel, but I'll also have to deal with a much thinner wall. Now let's go back to my 2 boards and lay out some bandsaw lines. It was important to cut my original board down the middle first before doing this layout. If I had done the layout first, I would have lost at least 1/8 of an inch of my ring diameters because of the saw blade curve. I've decided, based on previous projects, to make my cuts at 40 degrees. That's 40 degrees from the top surface or 50 degrees from the bottom surface. I've established the center, and I've placed a mark about 3/4 inch away in order to create a 1.5 inch diameter base ring. And I'm using my compass to mark the largest diameter that I can achieve from this board. Using my sliding bevel set at 40 degrees, I'm drawing lines. These will indicate the small base diameter and the outside largest ring. I think I've got enough wood between my inside and outside cuts to harvest 4 rings. So I've simply divided the space into 4 equal units and drawn the remaining cut lines. Now it's a simple matter of transferring a few pencil marks to the top surface and clamping these 2 halves together so that I can draw my circles using my compass. As you design your own layout, I recommend that for your first project using this technique that you arrange your cut lines at least 3/8 of an inch apart. This should provide just a little extra wall thickness to play with. Okay, we're done here. Let's go over to the bandsaw. It's a good idea to always look your saw over before doing these kind of cuts. Make sure the blade's tight. Make sure your guides are properly adjusted. Spend just a couple minutes adjusting things to get the saw to run as true as you can. And just make the cutting go easier. Adjusting the table angle is a simple matter of using the sliding bevel which was used for the layout lines. I've found it to be easier to make these kind of cuts by following the side of a line, as opposed to trying to follow the center of the line. Go slow and easy. There's no rush. If you make a minor deviation, it's no big deal. That's why you've got a little extra wall thickness to play with. Okay, I've cut all my half rings. There's my bottom and the 4 rings, half rings that'll go on top. Now this wood may have moved a little bit. There may have been some bound up stress which was released when the rings were cut. So what started off as nice straight edges may not be that straight anymore. And the only way to get, really perfect glue lines on these ends is to touch them up with some sandpaper. Now if you don't have a disc sander, I'll show you another way in a second. But I do, and I use it extensively. This disc is going counterclockwise. I've actually got it on coast. I've turned the disc sander off. This is not aggressive sanding. I'm just going to take the half ring and just brush it against the moving sandpaper. It just takes a little bit. Always carefully inspect your glue joints before gluing. These 4 ends are ready for glue, and that'll be the next step. Now if you don't have a disc sander, this is one way you can do it by hand. This is 80 grit sandpaper adhered to a piece of MDF with spray adhesive. Just take your half rings and place them on there nice and flat, and make some passes back and forth very lightly. Be very careful not to let that ring tilt back and forth. Keep it very flat. It doesn't take much, just a few passes. I'm going to put these halves together with what's called a rub joint. It's just what it sounds like. A little tight bond original on one side. One side can spread glue to the other side. And then find a very flat surface. Here I'm using a board of MDF. I'm going to apply pressure and vigorously rub these 2 surfaces back and forth. That will drive glue from the seam. I'll hold pressure for a few seconds, I'll release it, and then I won't disturb it for a while. It'll produce a very acceptable seam. Now you might be thinking, well, what about clamps? This needs to be clamped. Well, the vigorous rubbing and the pressure that you apply is a very effective way to drive the excess glue out of the joint. And that's essentially what a clamp does. The nature of the glue is such that once the excess is out, there's no additional pressure pushing the joint apart. It's quick, it's easy, it's effective, and it'll produce a very good looking glue joint. Now you'll notice I've only applied glue to one surface initially, but I've used that surface to apply it to the other matching surface, and I've done a careful job of inspecting. I want to make sure all the surfaces have glue before I do that final assembly. With this part done, I can let these sit for at least 20 minutes. The glue joints are now cured. We can actually stack these up and take a look at what this bowl's going to look like. They don't stack very well because there's glue squeeze out on these surfaces. The next step will be to flatten these so they can be stacked together. Now I've divided the assembly of the bowl into 3 parts. The base, which will go on a waste block. The next 2 rings I'll join and make one. I'll only focus on this center seam. The last 2 rings, I'm not going to worry about the outsides. It's just that center seam that I'm going to focus on. Once again, we can use the 80 grit, kind of a manual disc sander, if you will. It only takes a few swirling motions. Do a close inspection of the surfaces. Get the surfaces nice and clean before proceeding to the actual glue job. Now, if you've got a disc sander, you can really make short work of flattening these discs. It just takes a few swirling motions. Again, it's not aggressive sanding. My disc here is on coast. It just takes a few seconds on there, and I've got a perfectly flat surface ready for gluing. And if you've got a magic stick of bloodwood, well, you can do your sanding this way. So now we have the surfaces all sanded, smooth, ready to be glued. There's a good chance that there'll be some dust on there. So compressed air is a wonderful tool to get those surfaces nice and clean. You've got to have clean surfaces in order to get the best glue joint. Now clamping, as you can see, the clamp won't engage on the underside. But the temporary use of a piece of MDF solves that problem. Now I can apply a clamp and have it do its thing. I'll probably put 3 or 4 clamps around this. Now the other decision is these vertical seams. What do I do with those? I could line them up, but there's really no need. They're going to disappear almost. And I'll get a stronger construction if I just offset them a little bit to create a bit of a bricklay effect. For glue, I'm using Titebond Original, just as I used it putting the half rings together. A bead on one side and then using that to spread glue to the other side seems to work pretty well. Always make sure you inspect. You don't want to miss any surfaces. Now things will tend to slip and slide quite a bit. That's a good thing. That slipping and sliding is forcing glue out of the seams. I'm using my fingertips. I'm trying to keep things as centered as possible. Now, if things are not centered, I'm going to lose some valuable wall thickness. I'll end up with a very thin vessel if I can get a vessel at all. So keeping things centered is very, very important. Now, the other 2 rings I'm joining just the same way, a bead of glue, a little larger piece of MDF to accommodate my clamps, and I'm putting a couple of extra clamps on there. But again, I'm being very careful to keep things centered. So the 5 components have now been reduced to 3. The next step will be to take this small base and put it on a waste block. I've mounted a red faceplate to a piece of mesquite. I want that outgoing surface to be as flat as possible. Not just smooth, but flat in order to mount the first ring. I'm using a large, heavy-duty, round-nose scraper. Scrapers do a better job of flattening than a bowl gouge. They just seem to work better in this regard. A few light passes. The sound can tell you if the edge is catching the wood evenly. Your finger can tell if it's smooth, but from side to side, one side over to the other, it's difficult to tell if it's straight or if it's got a little dip or a little high spot. All of these types of flat glue surfaces need to be checked with a straight edge. They really have to be perfectly flat. You can't tell with your finger. A straight edge with a flashlight is pretty effective to show up any defects. 80 grit sandpaper will improve the surface, but you really need to work at this, get it as smooth and as flat from side to side as possible. The lathe tailstock can be used as both a centering device and as a clamp. I've slightly enlarged the dent that my compass made when I drew my layout circles. I know this dent is centered. It has to be centered because that's the point from which I drew all the circles. Now, a little glue on the underside. Spread the glue onto the mesquite waste block. We'll bring up the tailstock, clamp this, and let that have some time to cure. Now, I won't turn this for at least an hour, and I'll leave it clamped for at least 10 or 15 minutes. Well, it's now been well over an hour. I want to make this round. I want to true it up round so it's easier to eyeball fit it to the next component. And while I'm at it, I'll take a little wood out of the center. That'll make it easier to true up that surface, the flat horizontal surface going against the next ring. During these steps of truing up, be careful not to remove too much wood. Keep your options open. Only remove what you know you will not need later on. To achieve a really perfect horizontal glue line between these rings, that surface that I'm working on here has to be perfectly flat from side to side, not just smooth. The large round nose scraper does a pretty good job of getting that flat. 80 grit sandpaper on a sanding block would be the next step. Now, in addition to using a straight edge with a flashlight to check for flatness, using pencil marks can be very effective. By applying the 80 grit just ever so briefly to those pencil marks, I can tell if the surface is flat. If all the marks disappear almost instantly, evenly, then I know I've done a good job with my tooling. Okay, let's take a look. I've got a little pencil to the outside. This is telling me that the inside is still just a tad too high. Another pass or two with the scraper, and then going through the same process of applying the pencil and touching it with the sandpaper. I have to get this so that the briefest of sanding removes all the pencil marks instantly. Now that the surface is perfectly flat, I want it perfectly clean. A little compressed air does that job, and it's ready for the next glue job. Now I've taken rings 2 and 3 and eyeballed them center onto this disc of MDF. The hole in the back is a result of turning that MDF with a screw chuck, so I know the hole is centered to the disc. A few dabs of hot melt glue will hold my rings in place. Now, before gluing this on, I took my disc over to the disc sander and just touched up that surface briefly to get rid of the glue squeeze out and make that surface perfectly flat. It's a good practice to dry fit things before you apply glue, just to confirm that everything will go together the way you want them to. A bead of glue, using one surface to apply glue to the other, making sure everything is covered, and then again I can bring up the tailstock to provide both centering and pressure while the glue sets up. One last thing to pay attention to, the vertical seams. I want to offset them about a 1/4 inch. That'll give me a little additional strength from the bricklay effect. You'll notice I'm rotating the disc back and forth. I'm doing that as I apply pressure. That's driving glue from the joint. Now, once that tackiness has started, I'll lock the tailstock in place and let this sit for a while. Okay, I'm back. It's been at least an hour. At this stage of the game, I want to true up the ring that I just added, and I want to flatten the top in preparation for joining the next layers. My diamond-pointed scraper allows me to get into that corner to remove the MDF. It's important to true things up as you add elements. Otherwise, you run the risk of your assembly drifting away from being centered. And it's my habit whenever I have a chance to go in the inside, true it up as well, remove all those bandsaw marks, and make things round. This is just preliminary wood removal. Only remove wood you know you don't need. Now that leading surface, that has to be obviously flattened as well. Same process. A few scraping passes, the pencil marks, applying the sandpaper ever so briefly. One of the most common methods that I use for stacking rings, and this frees up my lathe, is to come over to my workbench and use a clamp. A pipe clamp like this. One of those clamps that allows you to push. This next step is going to be to glue this to that. The surfaces are very clean and the surfaces are perfectly flat. A little wax paper, and underneath here I've got a thin rubber router pad. Say that 3 times. The pad just helps to spread the pressure a little more evenly. I'll put a little piece of wood on there just so I have a place for my clamp to rest, and then I'll apply just a little pressure. I'm using my fingertips to center things, and over here you can see some pencil lines which indicate where my vertical seams are. I've offset those during each glue job by about a 1/4 inch. Those seams should pretty much disappear when I turn the bowl because the grain matches so perfectly. Focus with your fingertips. Keep things as centered as possible. Now, as for the rest of this project, I'm not going to spend a lot of time detailing all the turning and sanding and finishing and so forth. It's a pretty standard turning operation. I use a combination of 1/2-inch bowl gouge, use an assortment of scrapers. I use whatever tool works the best. I've turned this vessel down to just under 1/8 of an inch. And before I proceed with sanding, I normally apply sanding sealer and then scrape that sealer off with handheld cabinet scrapers. It seems to have worked for me. I'll do this 3-4 times sometimes just to get all the pores filled. You can see the sealer coming off here with the scraper. After I've done that, I'll sand from probably starting with 220 up to 600. This particular bowl, I used a gloss poly finish on it. After about 4 coats, it was buffed. I'm using a thin parting tool to remove it from the waste block. Then I'll use a piece of MDF to create a jam chuck in order to finish off the base of the vessel. Here I'm just using a little piece of wood to provide a little security with my jam chuck. Just a few passes with a diamond pointed scraper cleans up the bottom. I can hand hold the bowl into the jam chuck just to do a little bit of sanding. And I normally score a few lines just to show it was turned on the bottom. From there, it's over to the wood burner to sign my name, and I usually date my pieces. Make sure you do put your name on your work. Okay, let's run through a real quick review. You got to select the wood, you got to mill the wood, then you got to split it in half. Do some doodling, figure out your angles, lay out the circles, cut your half rings, sand the ends, join the halves, flatten them, put them together into pairs. Start off your vessel with the base, add rings, flatten as you go, continue the stacking, turn to final shape, apply finish, reverse mount, don't forget to sign, and you're done. It's a clever way to make a bowl from a minimum amount of wood, but more than that, it's a technique that can be modified using laminated material. All these vessels were created using the same stacked angle cut ring technique, the big difference being that the material was laminated before the rings were cut. Now this project here was done with just 3 pen blanks. I did an article a while back. I'll show you the slides. A PDF file of the magazine article is available on my website. That little bowl was constructed from just these 3 small pen blanks. I split them on the bandsaw first and then cleaned them all up with glueable surfaces, cut some veneers, laminated together into this rectangular lamination. Then I split the lamination on the bandsaw, as you can see, cleaned that up, clamped it together with tape, drew my circle layout just like our maple bowl, cut the half rings, same procedure, and then took the half rings, made full rings out of them, cleaned those up, started the project with the bottom ring, and individually stack the rings into a bowl form that could be turned. It's a cute little project. So whether you use pen blanks or 2x4s, have some fun with this technique.